Welcome to Recalibrate Reality, the future of New York. Our guest today is the retired four-star General Stanley Mcchrystal. General McChrystal has served our country for over 30 years, most recently as the commander of Joint Forces in Afghanistan. He now leads the McChrystal Group, where he works with private sector leaders on helping them tap the potential of their teams to reach the outcomes they're looking for. In this episode, we cover a number of topics, such as learning to safely coexist with COVID-19, the lessons learned from our fight in Afghanistan, his thoughts on the January 6th insurrection, and the importance of citizenship, as well as much more. And so now, let's recalibrate reality with General Stanley Mcchrystal. General McChrystal, welcome to Recalibrate Reality.
Well, Scott, thanks for having me, and please call me Stan. We're friends for a long time now.
No, I appreciate it. And I want to thank you for all your service to this nation for so many years. And I also want to thank you for your leadership that you have been bringing, even in your post-military career. And in terms of your leadership, you've also been a prolific writer about leadership. And your most recent book is about risk, and it's a user guides to risk, which is sort of ironic that it comes out right while we're as a country living through this unprecedented pandemic. In writing that book and since it's come out, what's some of your big takeaways that you can share with our viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the biggest takeaway is slightly depressing. It's the greatest risk to us is us. Now, the flip side of that, the greatest opportunity for us, ability for us to get much better in dealing with risk, lies with us as well. And that's good news because we have agency. But the reason we took on the subject of risk is because I think most of us think we're pretty good at risk. We're experts at risk. We deal with it in our business world or our military world. But then you actually look at our record of performance. I know my record in the military was uneven. And then you look at the 9/11 attack, all the information existed inside the United States government to stop that attack, but we couldn't connect the dots. Or the financial crisis of 2008. All the indicators and weaknesses were there and evident, yet we couldn't stop that. And then COVID-19 is almost a classic case. We know that viruses like the COVID-19 novel coronavirus come frequently, and they become a pandemic periodically. And we know what to do about it because we have this tremendous experience in public health. And then this time, we also got a medical miracle because we got these vaccines created faster than ever in history. So in that case, we had awareness of it. We had practice in preparing for it. We got this gift of the vaccines, and yet we still dropped the ball. So how often do we have risks that are knowable generally, but our performance is very, very weak? And we ought to step back and say, well, that should tell us something. And my conclusion, and after we studied it, was the reality is you can't predict risks with great clarity, either the timing or exact nature of them. What you can predict is threats will come. And so what you can do, though, is you can prepare your organization and yourselves to be more resilient in the face of those risks, stronger. It's almost like as we work out to increase our health, we can do the same with our organizations against risk.
It's interesting. You mentioned 9/11, and I frequently draw the parallel to our response to 9/11 versus our response to COVID. And I feel, and particularly as it relates to leadership, right? I think the leadership post 9/11 was that we have a new message, we have a new risk that we're going to have to coexist with, which is this threat of terrorism. And they were going to put in the infrastructure and encouraging people to move forward it was a patriotic civic duty to do so. With COVID, it feels like our leadership hasn't transcended to that level of a recognition that we need to coexist with this. And there's been a lot of hyperbole and mixed messaging along the way that I think has impacted our ability to move forward. And as you said, I think our scientists have done a great job giving this miracle of the vaccine, but our leaders haven't grabbed a hold of it and made sure that it was something that people were able to ride that success and help us to learn to coexist with this virus. Why do you think that is?
I think there are a number of reasons, but I agree with your analysis. I think first, after 9/11, one of the things our national leadership gave us was a pretty clear narrative. They said, okay, here is a new threat. This is the magnitude of this threat. we are going to unite on that. And they stayed pretty consistent on that. Now, there were some missteps. There were some overreaction to terrorism and whatnot. But the reality is we brought the country together and focused on that problem to deal with it. And we said we won't stop focusing on it until that problem is managed or goes away completely. With COVID-19, from the very beginning, we didn't take the time to educate the American people. Here is the reality of what a pandemic like that means, what exponential growth of a virus like this actually is, and what threat it constitutes. We sent mixed messages. And then pretty quickly, we also let it become political. We started taking actions and making decisions for political gain at various levels, not all just at the national level, at different levels. And that undercut people's confidence in leadership in America. So people started to doubt, even in things like the CDC and the FDA, they started to question the guidance that they were being given. And then political opportunities leveraged that. And I think that has made our response much weaker than it could and should have been.
Yeah, I remember almost a year ago this week, I think it was a year ago this week, that we had Sandra Lindsay, was the nurse at Northwell Health, who was the first person in the United States to actually get the vaccination. And I remember in my mind thinking it was like the cavalry being called in. We now have a path forward, a path to freedom from this virus, and yet a large percentage of our population haven't been willing to take the vaccine. Again, is that communication? Is that the politics? Is that social media driving things? What do you think? And are there ways that we can help unite us to recognize this is our path forward?
I think it's a little of all of that. Anytime you want a society to do something, it takes some important messaging, because everybody's got a different position in life and perspectives that they grow up with, and doubts and fears. So it really takes leadership to communicate in a very clear way. In my sense, the narrative around COVID-19 should have been one of a war against a faceless enemy. This is an enemy that can do us great harm, and we need to unite against us, which means that all of us have a responsibility to do our part of the defense. My interpretation of the vaccine was not that, is it good for me? My interpretation was, as I take a position in this defensive line against the virus, it's my responsibility to do my part, which is to get vaccinated so that I'm not a weakness. I'm not a hole in the line. And so the vaccine has always been about my responsibility to everybody else. Yet I don't think we've messaged that as we could, because I think Americans will respond to that kind of request that says, I know you're concerned, but the reality is, if we don't do this together, if we don't sort of link arms and do it, it will never be as effective as it needs to be.
We've had a similar messaging as we think about reopening New York City and bringing people back to the office, because as you look at New York City's recovery, which has been, pretty astounding in terms of how being the earliest one impacted by COVID, as a community going and working remotely and staying away from each other, social distancing to deal with flattening the curve and helping our healthcare system. And now about 80% vaccinated. But what hasn't happened is we haven't been able to bring people back to the workplace. And the people that are being hurt are the small businesses, the retailers, the restaurants. And if you look at the recovery of New York City's job market, we're down by the rest of the country by about half in terms of that recovery. And it's those businesses that are being impacted. We continually try to reiterate the message that you made, which is this is a civic responsibility to bring people back to the workplace. If people aren't back in the workplace, they're not shopping in the local store, they're not going to the local restaurant, or if we're not able to bring tourism back, we're not going to be able to do that. And I think that concept of imaging and messaging from leadership is going to be a key thing as we move forward here in New York and for our country, because particularly if you have a state and a city like New York doing this, others will start to follow.
If you think about all the things that we take advantage of and take for granted if we live in a city sometimes, the convenience, we can go down to the corner store and get something. We go to a restaurant, we can go to a bar. We can enjoy all of those things because it's a living, working ecosystem with all of the pieces. And when COVID-19 hit, certain people had the opportunity to either leave the city or lock themselves into a small area because of the nature of their job or the means that they had to do that. Other people had to get out there and keep collecting garbage or keep making basic infrastructure work. And then, as you mentioned, those people in the middle who are dependent upon the ecosystem being healthy and work for their business to thrive. Well, if that goes away, if they fail, of course, our quality of life for the people who depend upon them to be able to go to those things suffers. So I think this gets back to the common mission again. What we really want to do is get to the point back where we all enjoy all the components of where we live, all the aspects of it. And so we have to take a look that says, what, not just what's best for me in this particular moment, but what helps get all of this back healthy again. I would also argue that until we have the opportunity for everyone to go back to work, maybe not every day, I know we talk a lot about the new normal,
Yep.
but young people learn an awful lot in the office. You and I both learned from peers. You look left and right and you saw somebody who'd been there a year longer than you and they knew more. And so you emulated them. And so we need to give that opportunity to people.
Yeah, and I'm sure you must have seen this in the military, and I think you wrote about it a little bit in your book, which is there's a sense of inertia and almost become complacent. And I think a little bit in New York, there's a little bit of PTSD from living through those moments in March and April of 2020 when we had the sirens going off. How, as a leader, do you help deal with some of those challenges, the complacency, the anxiety, after such an extended period of time, almost going on 2 years now of living in this state of play?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm just reading a book now about Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. And of course, she grew up in East Germany. And so when the wall came down and they went to unification, what they found is people from East Germany had a different habit and perspective. They were overcome a little bit with the inertia because they hadn't been in the same kind of economy. They didn't show the same kind of energy, intellectual curiosity, because there had been no place for it. We've now been through about 2 years of this COVID. And so the reality is it gets kind of comfortable to sit at home in pajama bottoms and do a Zoom. And even though it might not be quite as effective as what you did before, it's kind of convenient. And if each of us is a little bit lazy, we'll do that. And of course, if we've got other reasons, like if we've got kids that aren't in school or something, there's another compelling factor. But we've got to get ourselves back out. And that's going to take a bit of leadership. It's going to take society deciding how we want to operate, which means that I think New York City's made some tough decisions about vaccine mandates and requirements, because those are, to some people, politically unpopular, but it's like forcing air into the lungs of someone who's been drowning. Let's get the air into lungs. Let's get restaurants operating, bars going. Let's get things moving. And to do that, we've got to require people to be a little more disciplined about public health things than we did before, and to make some tough calls like getting vaccinated. And so I think leadership has got to make those tough calls to create the opportunity and say, we are going to go on and conduct sports events and this. We're just going to force people who participate and attend those things to go through certain things, because we've got to get air in the lungs and we've got to get the patient moving again.
Yeah, I was in a meeting with Mayor-elect Adams yesterday, and he was talking about the need to bring people back. And he had a few observations that were consistent, and I think had some similarities from of things you might see in the military. One was like the peace dividend. He was talking about the public safety being an economic stimulus, and that one of the things he hopes to do is flood our streets, our transit systems with police so people feel safe, right? And they come back to the city. The second is getting companies to pledge to bring their people back to the city, and buying into that fact that this is a civic obligation and commitment that we need to be united around if we're going to be successful. And the third is to do as you had said, which in terms of getting the public health regimens in place, but then letting the rest of the country and the world know, if you want to come back to a place that's energized, that has the culture, that has the level of activity in a post-pandemic world, New York is the place. And to then reignite tourists to come back to New York. And I thought it was good, messaging, to your point, and a good strategy to try to deal with some of that complacency.
Yeah, I think it's getting the life back in all the different pieces of it. Without security, people won't go. It's almost like what we found in counterinsurgency. You've got to create security so economic progress and all can be pushed forward. And I think that's where we are now. I do think there's a pent-up demand for it. There's a desire from everybody to have New York City work again. I don't live in New York City. I used to, but I don't live there now. But I want it to work. And when it goes there, I want it to be New York City. I don't want it to be something different. And I think that's true of where we live, but it's also true of iconic places in America. So New York City almost has a responsibility as being a representative emblem or symbol for the United States of, just like you built back after 9/11, okay, we're building back over COVID, and this is going to be a place to come to do business, to do tourism, to do arts and things, unlike any in the world.
I want to pivot to outside of New York City for a second, but tie it back a little bit, which is your experience in Afghanistan, right? And after 20 years, President Biden pulled us out of Afghanistan. You were the commander of the Joint International Forces there. So you saw that situation. You saw what we faced firsthand. I'm curious, as you step back, could we have done something different to made that a successful mission for the United States?
Yeah, Scott, it's a fair question. And I'll tell everybody up front, I'm biased. I spent time in Afghanistan. I care about the country and the people. So everybody needs to discount my responses a little bit, simply because I do care about that. And I thought that the outcome was very sad. We could have done things differently. Just to remind people, Afghanistan had been at war for 20 years when we arrived in 2001. The previous 20 years, the Soviet year and then our decade, and then they'd had a civil war, but between Mujahideen groups and then the arrival of the Taliban. And so for 20 years, they'd had really upsetting conflict. So we arrived in 2001 to push out al-Qaeda. And in so doing, we toppled the government of the Taliban. And so we're left with this situation where al-Qaeda is largely dispersed, but we've got this damaged, ungoverned country. And what do? There's a certain people said we should have just packed up our stuff as soon as al-Qaeda left and come home. Well, one, it would have been easy for al-Qaeda to come back to an ungoverned space. But second, there was a moral responsibility, like there any part in the world, help them put it back together. So we started a 20-year effort to do that. What we could have done better was get clarity on our mission and our commitment early. We never really were 100% agreed upon what we were trying to do, what success looked like. Some people thought it was just keeping al-Qaeda out. Some people thought it was building Afghanistan into a viable state, and everything in between. And so without being well aligned on that, we had, sort of constant friction over it. And then internal to Afghanistan, if you're going to try to build a state, you need to establish security, as Mayor Adams is going to try to do here. You need to build up governance, which is the legitimacy of the government, so people believe in it. And you need to increase the economic activity. Those three things go together. Security, obviously, the prerequisite first. We did better at that than most people realize. We actually did a pretty good job. Not very well in the first years because we didn't put much into it, but later it got better. Where it was really hard was in governance. It was trying to create a legitimate government of Afghanistan. And so when Afghanistan fell in the summer of 2021, it wasn't conquered by the Taliban. It was occupied. What happened was when the Americans pull out, the confidence of the Afghan people in their own government and the confidence of the Afghan people in the ability of their police and military to stay cohesive evaporated. And so it just imploded. Now, the answer is, should that have happened after 20 years of assistance and whatnot? The answer is no, obviously. We wish that wouldn't have happened, and we think it shouldn't have happened. But they were always worried about the day we left, and they struggled with corruption and things. And then after the Doha Accords were signed in 2019, guaranteeing America's departure on 1 May 2021, the Taliban used that to go around all the different provinces of the company and simply say, the Americans are leaving on this date certain, things are going to change. It's time for you, governor here, to make an accommodation because you don't want to be the last person killed here. And so they got leaders and people around the country just in the middle frame of mind that says, okay, as soon as this happens, we'll tip. And that's what happened. Now, Afghanistan's got a bit of a tradition of that. They did that when we arrived in 2001 as well. And we were happy about it then. We weren't happy about it here. I think what we really need to do is look at the experience and say, what could we do better? And I've, of course, searched for that one stupid person who screwed it up, or that one bad decision, or any number of things. And I can't find that. I find good people working hard, trying to get a good outcome, but we didn't get a good outcome, which ought to give us pause and make us look at is what is it about our ability to do a sustained effort in a coordinated fashion that came up short. And I don't buy the argument that the mission in Afghanistan was impossible. Because if you accept that, you say we have an excuse for not succeeding, and therefore we don't look at our own shortcomings. I think it was possible, and I think that we didn't achieve what we wanted, and we need to really go to school on all the process and politics and things that could have been done better. And I certainly accept responsibilities for things during my time in command that could have been done better, and on my part as well.
Yeah, that's as I was listening to you, two points that jumped out at me related to the circumstance we're in right now. One is the concept of having clarity around the mission, and if you reflect on it, it's as if we have the wrong mission as it relates to our response to COVID. We're not going to eradicate COVID, right? There'll be COVID-19, there'll be COVID-25. Our mission needs to be, how do we put in the infrastructure, the protocols, the commitment to coexist with COVID so that we can preserve as much life and livelihood as possible. And then the second thing that jumped out at me, that I'm curious, because you've been living in this world of government and bureaucracy and politics, is the overall loss of confidence of the U.S. public to large bureaucracies, whether it's a government bureaucracy, a business bureaucracy, that they're there, that they can't get things done themselves. I mean, I've seen in New York in the public bureaucracies related to building large infrastructure projects, as an example. From your experience, someone that's been in that world, the center of all of these things converging, the politics, the execution, the people that, as you pointed out, 99.9% of the time are the most committed, hardworking, caring people, but sometimes the bureaucracy itself creates its own fate. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, and if there's a way that we can shift that in a place like the United States.
Yeah, Scott, I think you've nailed something really important. All my time in government, I was in the military, but dealt with civilian parts of government. You're exactly right. The average person in government is dedicated, hardworking, bright, all of the things you want in employees. But there is a sense of almost forlorn frustration because they deal with the bureaucracy. And what that does, it's insidious. Over time, it creates this lowered expectation of what they can accomplish. They are working on something, and you'll have a conversation and say, okay, perfect world, how would you do this and what would you accomplish? And they will describe that to you. And then you say, well, why don't you do that? And they say, well, we can't because we've got this law regulation, the politics of this, the bureaucracy of this. And over time, they are self-limited because we create all these barriers around ourselves and it becomes excuses for lack of progress. And I would argue we even have that at the highest levels of government. We get to our Congress and we say, why don't you do X, Y, and Z? And they go, well, we can't because the political this and whatnot. And the reality is we are self-limiting ourselves as a nation and our effectiveness. In a good company, a good corporation, you can't put up with that because if there's tremendous competition, you've got to get effective and efficient in the process. And you've got to be willing to make those tough decisions to beat through it. What the problem is in places like the government, we've allowed other considerations to triumph, political reasons or sometimes lethargy. And we've got to admit that if government doesn't work effectively, people lose confidence in it. What happened in Afghanistan is, for example, the Taliban would come at night into a small village and it would conduct court, legal court, land disputes and things like that. And they did it because it was a way to get support from the people because the regular Afghan government's courts were largely corrupt and very difficult to deal with. And so they offered an alternative. The people didn't like the Taliban. The Taliban weren't wildly popular. In fact, they had like a 6% approval rating, but they provided certain things that people needed. Government's got to do that. Government's got to do it in a way that is effective and efficient enough to be legitimate with the population. And in some cases, that's going to take some serious reform in our political system and in our inside in our governance. And we need to be willing to do that.
Yeah, as I think back on COVID, it was this incredible accelerant, and a lot of the trends that were happening pre-COVID, like the loss of trust in big bureaucracies and the effectiveness of government and new models that were out there were being considered, are even more important today, right? The playbooks of the past can't be the playbooks of the future. And one theme that's come up a lot on this program, people thinking about public-private partnerships, that if you can align interests with the private sector, be able to leverage their innovation, their entrepreneurship, their discipline, their ability to assess risk and consequences if they don't deliver, that's a model that's worked. And you, in terms of your time in the military, were also a paradigm shift when you started your role in Afghanistan, which was it went from this sort of control and command approach to leadership and oversight of the troops to now a much more decentralized approach, because the enemy was much more decentralized. And I know that as we're reimagining how we have to work and live in a post-COVID world, there's a lot of lessons in that. Could you share with us that experience and some of the lessons that we should be thinking about?
Sure, and I think the lessons are absolutely relevant. My journey really took off in 2003 when I was commanding our counterterrorist forces, the Joint Special Operations Command. And we were across 27 countries, but primarily our biggest fight was in Iraq. And what we found was our enemy, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, was extraordinarily different than anything we'd ever faced before. It was bigger, it was adaptable, it was fast, it had a DNA that we didn't understand at first, and it was enabled by information technology and then the leadership of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the young Jordanian who ran it. And what he did was he ran a new age organization for a new kind of environment, in which case they operated very autonomously in various sectors, but connected by an overall intent. And they connected so well that they could conduct an operation in one city, learn lessons from that, operational lessons, and apply those lessons the next day in another city. We couldn't do that. And so the reality was they were this completely different entity, and yet we were the best counterterrorist force in the world, but purpose-built for another time and another model. We were slower, more deliberate, elegant in our precision. And what we found is in that environment for about 2 years, we were losing to this enemy that had less technology, less professionalism than we had, but they were operating in this model that was incredibly effective. So we changed our method of operating. We changed how we managed information. We pushed decision-making way down. And as a result, we sped way up. I was the commanding general, and when I took over, I personally approved every operation, but then found out that was way too slow, and my value add to all these decisions was limited. And so we pushed that down, and instead my job became one of orchestrating this constant communication and collaboration so that people down low, closest to the problem, could make a good decision. And of course, there were initially worries that people who were less experienced or more junior were going to screw things up. But we found because they were closer, they understood the problem better. They knew when to execute much more appropriately than we did. And although they made some mistakes, cumulatively, it was far less than the big ones we made from being too far from the problem. And this is where it's germane to what we're doing now, because when we try to centrally manage something, and there is a temptation to do that with today's information technology, because in reality, you can connect everybody. So if you want to be the puppet master and, control the marionettes, you can technologically do that. It's just extraordinarily ineffective because it slows people down. It takes away their initiative. It doesn't leverage the judgment of everyone. And yet information technology, if you use it right, allows you to pump information down and across your organization, so that everyone in the bureaucracy of New York City knows what the mayor's trying to do, knows what the big direction is, the narrative is, knows the outcomes we're looking for. And then they adapt to conditions on the ground to achieve those outcomes. They may not do the same thing because every part of the city is different. Every responsibility is different. They do whatever it is links to create that outcome. And so I think it's the ability to admit that technology's made the problem harder, but it also can be part of the solution.
Yeah, as I listen to you, I think from the standpoint of our viewers, one of the lessons that people say a lot is, never waste a crisis. I know another way to think about it, particularly here, is in COVID, it's an opportunity to say, okay, what was in the past is not going to be what is in the future. And so make sure you're looking through the lens as to what the future was and not be a prisoner of the past, but be a pioneer of the future. And at RXR, we did what we call the pandemic pivot. And I know, and I appreciate you helped early on in our days trying to rethink how we were going to communicate in a more distributed way with our team members, and putting in protocols and daily task force meetings and making sure that information was disseminated, but then giving people the discretion in a box to know where ultimately we're trying to succeed, but move forward within that discretion. And so I think it's a unique opportunity for us as companies, as organizations, as a community to say, okay, we're having a reset here. Let's now use this crisis to reset how we did things in the past to be more effective in the future.
I had a boss once who told me that every military unit, when it is formed, ought to have a sunset date. And he offered 10 or 20 years. And on that date, the unit is dissolved. And I said, well, wow, what about all the traditions? What about all the things they've learned? And he smiled. He said, yep, be good to get rid of a lot of those, won't it? And his point was kind of what you did, Scott. It was liberating in the moment when you're suddenly allowed to get rid of everything you did before and then go pick the pieces of that you want to keep and just let the others go away. It gives you incredible freedom. But how often in big organizations do we do things because we've always done it? Why do we keep certain offices in bureaucracies, long after they really are needed? We do it because it's harder to get rid of them than it is just to keep them. And yet they're barnacles on the hull to progress. And so I think everybody should understand that we should be able to wipe the whiteboard clean and reimagine ourselves as often as needed.
I wanted to pivot a little bit because you talked about technology a little bit. And, one of the existential threats that I think we face as a country, at least in my view, is the sort of this weaponization of social media that's really, I think, fueled a lot of the divisiveness that we've seen in this country, and I think manifested itself in the peak form on January 6th. And so I'm curious, you've seen technology be really effective. You've seen technology be really dangerous, where it's required human interaction to diffuse some of the challenges. I'm curious from your experiences with balancing the benefits of technology, particularly when really life and death is on the line, to the benefits it also brings.
Yeah, I've done a lot of thinking on this, and here's where I've reached. I'm a huge technology enthusiast, and I think it's the future, and it should be, and we need to leverage. At the same time, I would argue that technology has gotten ahead of us as human beings. It is more capable than we are of dealing with it, meaning particularly social media, which has empowered everybody to communicate faster than they think and without the maturity we need. If I was going to draw an analogy, the one that I've used lately is it's a little bit like tobacco smoking was back in the 1940s. We figured out that smoking caused cancer, and it was pretty clear early on. And yet, because it was a pleasant thing to do, and because there were many stakeholders who made a lot of money associated with it, we continued to smoke at huge rates. And we went into a period, a bit of denial. The American Tobacco Institute said smoking might be bad for you, but we're just not 100% sure. And they left that little creek so that anyone who wanted to smoke could rationalize to themselves, well, it might not be bad. I think that social media is hurting us terribly right now. It's hurting our youth. It's changing the way they think. It is affecting, it's shaping all of our thinking. It's polluting our politics because it's this tool we're not mature enough to wield, or a weapon we're not mature enough to wield. And so we're going to have to come to grips with it in a way that's going to be pretty significant. And now the tension will be this idea that everyone has the right to do whatever they want, and that the First Amendment allows you to communicate any way you want. But I think we're going to find that an effective, vibrant democracy won't work when you can propagate absolute misinformation freely. And it's essentially free to propagate it. It doesn't even cost the old days you had to print leaflets and hand them out. Nowadays you can send it out in such volume and with such sophistication that all of us are vulnerable to it, you know, if they just keep pounding over and over. So we're going to have to admit that we've got to do something about it. And unfortunately, we're already past time we should have done something about it, because I think, again, it is a huge weakness. Now, countries around the world are all finding this, right. But I think this is one of those things that could kill mankind, because we could kill ourselves if we don't get smart enough to deal with it.
Right. Well, and as I said earlier, January 6th to me stuck out as a moment that it was so apparent. And you hear you as someone who's dedicated the majority of your adult life to defending our country against foreign actors who are trying to harm us. How did you feel watching our Capitol attacked by our own citizens?
Well, I was horrified, and I was also disgusted by what I saw. But here's a conclusion it took me just a little while to reach. The first is, I don't think many or any of the people up at the Capitol that day thought they were wrong. I don't think they thought they were doing something illegal or immoral. I think they thought they were doing what was being asked of them, and it was in their patriotic duty. Now, that should be much more disturbing than if we think they were just a bunch of people who were doing something that they knew was wrong. Because if there was that, then there'd be a certain percentage of Americans who would do that, but the large majority would never do that. But the problem is the large majority of Americans would do things they think are right, and they would do things whatever they are. So the question is, how do we get a group of people so influenced so that they do something that I consider completely antithetical to our democracy, and do it thinking that they are doing the right thing? And so we need to step back and say, all right, what caused that? What was the trail that got us there? And we better do something about it. And I would argue, first, it's this power of social media is one. And second, I think it's political opportunists. And I'll call it out. I think there are people who, on both sides, but in this particular case on the right, people find that they can resonate with people's passions. And they can get people inflamed and mobilized to do things, whether it's ride in the streets or go to the Capitol, and do some things that are really bad for society. And those opportunists know better. They're smart, clever people. But because it's in their interest, they do that. And I think there's a special responsibility that should be placed on those people who are guilty of that. Because if you have that kind of influence, it's like being in a leadership position. A military commander can get his forces or her forces to do almost anything you ask them to do, which means you have to be extraordinarily thoughtful what you ask them to do. And so I would argue that same responsibility now lies with people who influence populations to do things, particularly like that.
Yeah, no, that's a well said. Last question I just want you to comment on is one of the things that we've talked about earlier again was people who've committed and dedicated their lives to public service, particularly military service. And we have found at our firm at RXR, the hiring the veterans we have are so dedicated and such great leaders within our organization. But with all the mayhem that we've seen, with some of the more recent wars that we've lived through. It feels society as a whole don't necessarily pay the same level of respect to the men and women that were defending our country that they would deserve. And I would like you to share some advice to all of us as to how do we do a better job in this current environment to, helping and supporting and respecting and acknowledging the heroes that have defended our country.
Yeah, Scott, it's a great question. If you go to a Civil War battlefield, because those battlefields are in the United States and easy to visit, and you go to those and you see monuments placed on the battlefield. I have never seen one that proclaimed, yeah, we came here and we kicked the enemy's butts. We want to, it's not that braggadocious. What it is it says typically a unit name, and then it lists maybe the battles they were in and the casualties they suffered at that particular battle or all. And it was really just a reflection of when the nation needed us, we came and we served. Not everyone who serves in the military is a hero. And when people try to treat every veteran as a hero, veterans are very uncomfortable because they know that's just not the case. But if every American who serves our society, whether it's in uniform or in other ways, is reflected for doing what the nation needs to do, for standing up, whether you're a volunteer fire person or in the police or a teacher or serve in military uniform, if we just simply look at that and say, you have responsibilities as a citizen and you stood up for them, you did it, that is well done. And I think that's the real message we want to give. People join the military because we ask them to. People go to war because we send them. They are just a reflection of our society. And so we shouldn't treat them as outliers, as separate, albino unicorns that are wandering our streets, and we should point them out and look, there's a veteran. It's not that way at all. It should be just an individual, a young lady or young man who, when we asked, went and did their citizen duty. And we just need to make that idea of duty as a citizen so common and so expected. In fact, I would argue so demanded. It's almost like walking by trash in your neighborhood. If you walk by trash in the streets, it's your neighborhood. Maybe you didn't drop it, but it's your neighborhood. You're responsible for it. The United States is our neighborhood, and we all have responsibility to do those things required. And so I think what we need to do is give veterans the quiet support they deserve, and in our whole society, just give people the clear message that we respect and expect everybody to do their part.
Yeah, and a great example of that was the healthcare workers or the healthcare heroes that rose to the occasion during this COVID crisis, and how embraced they were, and translating that to others like those that serve in military or firefighters or police, as you had noted. General McChrystal, I know you call me Stan, but I got to end with General McChrystal here, because I got to say thank you for the service, but for you really demonstrate everything that one would want to see in an American, and someone that is committed to the prosperity and equality of this country, and someone that recognizes that it's about continual improvement, and that if we all work together, we could pass that forward and make our country a better place. So thank you for all that you do in your leadership and your friendship.
Well, thank you, Scott, for your friendship, making New York better and making the nation better.
Thank you, sir. That concludes this week's episode of Recalibrate Reality. COVID-19 and other public health threats are here to stay, but our freedom from the virus lies in all of us playing our part, using the tools at our disposal of masks and vaccines in order to safely coexist with the virus and reconnect with our communities. That is our mission. And I can think of no other city to lead the country and the world in this mission than New York City. This concludes our final episode of 2021. Over the past year, we've heard from over 30 different leaders from the worlds of the nonprofit sector, government, and business. And the biggest lesson that we've learned throughout the year is that there's no single leader or solution that can effectively address the challenge that we face as a region. As General McChrystal said, we all have a part to play. That is the duty and responsibility of citizenship. Thank you again for watching our series, and stay tuned for new episodes next year in our second season as we recalibrate reality for life in the new normal. Thank you again to General McChrystal, and a special thanks to the Regional Plan Association, the 92nd Street Y, and to the team for making this series possible. I'm Scott Rechler from 75 Rockefeller Plaza in New York. Happy holidays and have a happy new year.